He was never supposed to be the one people feared, not the man in the wheelchair by the window with rain streaking down the glass behind him, not the one whose hands rested too still in his lap, as if the world had already moved on without asking permission. And yet the first sound that truly filled that quiet roadside diner that night was not laughter, not music, not the clink of silverware, but a low, steady growl that seemed to rise from somewhere deeper than instinct, something old, something remembered, something that did not belong to weakness at all. Outside, the storm dragged its weight across the dark Kansas highway, headlights smearing into long ribbons of white against the wet asphalt, while inside the air smelled faintly of burnt coffee and warm grease, the kind of place where people came to forget things, not confront them. And Ethan Cole sat alone at a small booth near the corner, his chair angled just enough to give him a view of both the door and the narrow hallway leading to the restrooms, a habit he never quite unlearned. His shoulders broad but relaxed beneath a worn canvas jacket, his face calm in a way that didn't invite conversation, only silence. And at his side, lying perfectly still with his chin resting on his paws, was Rex, a German shepherd whose coat caught the dim overhead light in shades of sable and black, his ears twitching at every shift and sound, his amber eyes not restless but watchful, always measuring, always waiting. Most people who glanced their way saw only what was easy to see: a disabled man, a service dog, something to pity or ignore depending on the kind of night they were having. And for a while, that was exactly what happened. A waitress offered a polite smile. A trucker nodded once before returning to his plate. The storm outside kept most travelers moving instead of stopping. And for a few quiet minutes, it almost felt like the world had decided to leave them alone. Then the door opened again, letting in a rush of cold air and laughter that didn't belong to the rain. A group of young men stepped inside, loud in the careless way that comes from never having been tested, their boots heavy on the tile, their voices carrying without effort. And though they hadn't come for trouble, trouble has a way of finding the smallest cracks in a room, especially when someone looks like they won't push back. One of them noticed Ethan first, his eyes lingering just a second too long on the wheelchair, then flicking to his friends with a smirk that didn't need words. Another nudged a chair out of place as they passed. Not enough to be called anything, just enough to make space feel tighter. And still Ethan didn't move, didn't react, didn't even lift his gaze, because sometimes the strongest thing a man can do is refuse to give a moment more weight than it deserves. But Rex noticed, of course he did, his head lifting just an inch, not enough to draw attention, just enough to change the air around him, a subtle shift, like the moment before a storm decides whether it will pass or stay. And across the room one of the young men laughed again, a little louder this time, as if daring the silence to challenge him. And something in that sound lingered longer than it should have, stretching thin across the space until it brushed against something unseen, something neither loud nor visible, something that had once stood in places far worse than this and learned exactly when to stay still and when not to. Ethan's fingers tightened ever so slightly against the armrest, a movement so small no one else would have noticed, but Rex did, his ears rising now, his body still grounded yet ready, the kind of readiness that doesn't come from fear, but from memory, from training, from a promise made long ago and never broken. And for a brief second, as thunder rolled low across the sky outside, the room felt different, like it was holding its breath without knowing why, because weakness, real weakness, doesn't sit that still, doesn't carry that kind of quiet, and it certainly doesn't have something like Rex watching the door, as if every shadow had a name. Before we begin, tell me, where witching from drop your country in the comments. I'd love to see how far this story travels. 30 minutes earlier the rain had not yet turned heavy, only a steady whisper against the diner windows, the kind that softened the world instead of drowning it. And Ethan had rolled in quietly, pushing the door open with practiced ease, his chair humming low across the tile floor, as if it belonged there as much as any pair of boots. No hesitation, no announcement, just presence, the kind that did not ask for space but knew how to take it without force. And Rex had followed close at his side, not pulling, not leading, but matching him step for step like a shadow that chose to stay, their rhythm familiar, rehearsed not in comfort but in necessity, The waitress had glanced up from the counter, a woman in her late 40s with tired eyes and a softness that had not completely faded. She offered a small nod, the kind reserved for people who carried something heavier than they showed. "Sit wherever you like, honey," she had said, and Ethan gave a brief thank you, his voice calm, steady, not loud but not uncertain either. He chose the corner booth without thinking. Always the corner, always where he could see. Entrances and exits, habit layered over instinct until it became second nature. And when he settled, there was a moment, just a flicker, where his shoulders loosened, as if the act of sitting in a place that felt contained gave him a temporary peace he never quite trusted. Rex lay down beside him immediately, positioning himself just slightly outward, angled toward the room instead of the table, his eyes scanning once, slow and deliberate, not searching for threat, just mapping, always mapping, because safety was not something they assumed. It was something they built quietly in every space they entered. The diner itself carried the low hum of ordinary life. A radio playing somewhere behind the counter, forks tapping plates, a coffee machine hissing in the background, nothing sharp, nothing urgent, just a steady rhythm of people passing through. And for a few minutes, Ethan allowed himself to be just another person in that rhythm. He ordered black coffee, nothing else, and rapped, his hands around the mug when it arrived, letting the heat settle into his palms like something grounding, something real, his eyes drifting briefly to the window where passing headlights smeared across the glass, in long, pale streaks, each one gone before it could fully form, like thoughts he chose not to follow. And if anyone had been watching closely, they might have noticed the way his gaze lingered not on the road, but on the reflections, the faint shapes behind him mirrored in the glass, because he did not look directly unless he had to. He watched through angles, through fragments, through instinct, and Rex, still as stone beside him, noticed the same things without needing to move his ears, shifting subtly at each new sound, cataloging footsteps, voices, the slight scrape of a chair across the floor, until the door opened again and the air changed, not dramatically, not enough for most people to register, but enough for Rex to lift his head a fraction higher, because the sound that came with it was not just movement. It was energy, careless, unmeasured, the kind that did not consider consequence because it had never been taught to. The group entered laughing, boots heavy, voices overlapping, their presence expanding into the room as if space would naturally make room for them. And Ethan did not turn to look, not because he had not noticed, but because he had already calculated them, their number, their tone, their direction, all without lifting his head, and still he remained still, choosing calm over reaction, because sometimes attention is what gives a moment power. And he had learned long ago how to deny that power quietly, but Rex did not deny. He observed his gaze shifting now, fixed not on the loudest voice, but on the one that moved slightly differently, a fraction slower, a fraction more deliberate, the one whose silence did not match the others. And as that man's eyes flicked toward Ethan and lingered just a beat too long, something unspoken passed through the room, thin as a thread, almost nothing, but enough for Rex's chest to rise just a little deeper, enough for his body to shift from rest to readiness without breaking the stillness. And Ethan, feeling that change without looking, set his coffee down carefully, his fingers pausing against the rim of the mug, not tense, not afraid, just aware, because some moments do not announce themselves. Loudly, they arrive quietly, like a shift in the air you can feel before you can explain, and in that quiet, before anything had happened, before any word had been spoken directly, the night had already begun to turn. The laughter did not stop, it only shifted, lowering just enough to become something sharper, something that moved sideways instead of forward, and one of the young men dragged a chair out with his foot as he passed, not blocking the aisle entirely, just enough to force a decision, just enough to see if Ethan would adjust or hesitate. And that was how it always began, not with confrontation, but with small tests, quiet invitations for disrespect to grow roots. And Ethan saw it without looking. The angle, the distance, the intention, all of it mapped in a second that stretched longer than it should have, his hands resting on the wheels of his chair, still not gripping, not retreating, simply waiting, because movement, he knew, would be read as permission, and stillness would be read as something else entirely, something harder to define, something that made people uneasy when they could not label it, and Rex felt it too. The subtle tightening of space, the shift in tone that most people dismissed as nothing. His body no longer relaxed against the floor, but not yet standing. His muscles coiled beneath his coat like a quiet current. His gaze fixed now, not scanning, but holding on the one who had moved the chair, the one whose smile lingered a fraction too long, and the room continued around them as if nothing had changed, forks scraping plates, the radio humming a slow country song, the waitress refilling coffee at the counter. But under that ordinary rhythm, something else had begun, something thin and invisible, like the tension in a wire pulled just tight enough to sing if touched, and Ethan exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that did not release stress, but measured it, his eyes lifting at last, not to challenge, not to confront, but simply to acknowledge what stood in front of him. And when he nudged his chair forward, just enough to approach the space that had been narrowed, the wheel brushed lightly against the leg of the misplaced chair, a soft contact, almost nothing, but enough to draw attention, enough to turn heads, enough for the young man to glance down and then back up again with a grin that asked a question without words, a question that had been asked in different places, different times, by different faces, always the same, always testing, always assuming the answer before it was given. And Ethan did not answer, not with words, not with expression. He simply waited, because sometimes silence forces the other person to reveal more than they intend. And for a moment the young man hesitated, just a flicker, as if the lack of reaction did not match the script he had already written in his head. But pride has a way of pushing hesitation aside, and he leaned back slightly, letting the chair remain where it was, not moving it, not clearing the path, just leaving it there like a line drawn in chalk. And around them the laughter resumed, a little louder now, as if to cover the pause that had just happened, as if noise could erase uncertainty. But Rex did not look away, his ears forward now, his posture rising inch by inch, not sudden, not aggressive, just present, unmistakably present, and a low sound began deep in his chest. Not yet a growl, not yet a warning, just the first vibration of something that had been held back long enough. And Ethan heard it, of course he did, he always did, that subtle shift that told him the line had been crossed, even if no one else recognized it. And his fingers tightened slightly against the rim of the wheel, not in fear, not in anger, but in readiness, because the moment had changed, quietly, completely, and no one in that room understood it yet, except the two of them. The chair did not move, and that was the point. It stayed there like a quiet decision someone else had made for him, a small obstruction that carried more weight than it should have, and Ethan looked at it for a brief second before lifting his eyes again. Not irritated, not surprised, just measuring, always measuring, because the world had taught him that moments like this were never about the object itself, never about a chair or a narrow path, but about what people believed they could get away with when they thought no one would stop them. And the young man standing closest tilted his head slightly, studying Ethan now with a curiosity that felt almost casual on the surface, but underneath it carried something sharper, something that wanted a reaction. Any reaction, and when Ethan did not give it, that curiosity turned into something else, something that leaned forward, pressing just a little harder. "You need help getting through there?" he asked, his tone light but edged, with something that did not match the words, and a couple of his friends chuckled quietly behind him, not loud enough to be called out, just enough to reinforce the moment, and Ethan held his gaze for a second, steady, unflinching, before answering in a voice that stayed calm and level. "I am good." And that should have been the end of it. A simple exchange, a moment that passed, but did not pass, because the chair still remained where it was, and the young man did not move it, did not step aside, did not clear the space. Instead, he leaned one hand against the backrest of it, as if claiming it without saying so. And the silence that followed stretched thin, tight enough that even the waitress behind the counter glanced up, sensing something without fully understanding it. And Rex rose then, not suddenly, not in a way that startled, but with a slow, deliberate motion that changed the balance of the room, his paws placing firmly against the tile, his body aligning between Ethan and The space ahead, his head lifted, ears forward, eyes locked, and the low vibration in his chest deepened just slightly, still controlled, still restrained, but no longer hidden, and for the first time a young man's attention shifted fully to him, his smirk faltering for half a heartbeat. Not fear, not yet, but recognition of something he had not expected, something that did not match the easy picture he had already decided on. And one of his friends muttered something under his breath, a half joke that did not quite land because the air had changed again, quieter now, heavier, as if the room itself had leaned in to listen, and Ethan did not look at Rex. He did not need to. He felt the shift. Through the leash that hung loose between them, through the way the silence had sharpened, through the way even the smallest sounds now seemed too loud. And he spoke again, not louder, not firmer, just enough to fill the space without forcing it. Moved the chair, and there was no anger in it, no threat, just a statement placed exactly where it needed to be, and for a second nothing happened. The young man held his position, his hands still resting on the chair, his eyes flicking between Ethan and Rex as if trying to decide which one mattered more. And that was the moment everything balanced on, not in action, not in force, but in choice, because some lines are not crossed with noise, they're crossed with hesitation, with the realization that what you thought was simple might not be simple at all, and Rex took one slow step forward, just one, enough to close the distance by a few inches, enough for his presence to become undeniable, and the sound in his chest shifted then, no longer just a vibration, but the beginning of a growl that carried weight far beyond the room they stood in, a sound shaped by training, by memory, by moments no one here could see, and the young man's hand lifted from the chair without him realizing it. Just a reflex, just a fraction of movement, but enough to break whatever hold he thought he had on the situation, and in that small, almost invisible change, the balance tipped. The growl did not explode into the room. It settled into it, low and controlled, a sound that did not beg for attention, yet commanded it anyway, the kind of sound that carried history inside it. And for a brief moment, everything else seemed to fall away. The clink of dishes softened, the radio blurred into the background. Even the rain outside felt distant, as if the world had stepped back to listen more closely, and Rex stood there, steady, unmoving except for the slow rise and fall of his chest, his eyes locked forward with a focus that did not waver, not wild, not aggressive, but precise, intentional, the way something trained to protect learns to speak without chaos. And the young man in front of him felt it before he understood it, his body reacting a fraction of a second faster than his thoughts, his shoulders tightening slightly, his weight shifting back without permission, as if some instinct buried deeper than pride had recognized a line he could not quite see. And his friends, who had been laughing just seconds ago, went quiet in pieces, one voice trailing off, another cough cutting itself short, until the room settled into a silence that was no longer comfortable, no longer casual, but watchful. And Ethan remained still behind Rex, his posture unchanged, his hands resting lightly on the wheels, not gripping, not bracing, just present, as if he trusted the moment to unfold without needing to force it, because he knew something the others did not. He knew that the power in front of them was not in the sound itself, but in the restraint behind it, the choice not to escalate, the discipline to hold. And Rex took another slow breath, the growl deepening just enough to be unmistakable now, no longer a question, no longer a warning hidden beneath stillness, but a clear boundary drawn without a single step forward. And the young man's eyes flicked down to the dog, then back to Ethan, searching for something that would make sense of what he was feeling, something that would return control to him. But there was nothing there that fit his expectation, no fear, no apology, no need for approval, only calm, steady presence. And that absence of reaction unsettled him more than any confrontation could have, because it left him with nowhere to push, nowhere to prove himself. And his hand, which had rested so casually on the chair just moments ago, now hovered uncertainly at his side, fingers flexing once as if unsure what to do next. And behind him, one of his friends shifted his stance, glancing toward the door, then back again, a silent calculation forming, not spoken, not acknowledged, but shared, and the waitress had stopped mid-step near the counter, a coffee pot still in her hand, her eyes fixed on the scene with a quiet understanding that something important was happening, something that did not need interference, only space. And Rex held his ground, his gaze never breaking, his body aligned perfectly between Ethan and the narrow path ahead. And in that alignment, there was something unmistakable, something that reached beyond the moment, beyond the diner, beyond the storm outside, something that spoke of loyalty not as an idea, but as a promise kept over time, through places no one here could imagine. And the growl did not rise any louder. It did not need to. It simply stayed, steady and unwavering, like a line carved into stone. And the young man exhaled slowly, the sound barely audible, but enough to mark the shift inside him, the moment where confidence gave way to something else, something quieter, something closer to understanding. And without a word, he reached out and nudged the chair aside. The movement small, almost reluctant, but real, and the space opened again, just wide enough for Ethan to pass. Just wide enough for the moment to resolve without breaking, and Rex's growl faded as smoothly as it had begun, not disappearing entirely, but easing back in his silence, leaving behind only the echo of what had been understood without being spoken. And for a few seconds no one moved, as if the room itself needed time to catch up to what had just happened, and then Ethan rolled forward, calm, steady, passing through the space that had been denied to him only moments before, not in victory, not in defiance, just in quiet continuation, as if nothing needed to be proven at all. The space opened, but the weight of the moment did not disappear. It lingered in the air like the aftertaste of something strong, something not easily forgotten. And as Ethan moved forward, the soft hum of his chair blending back into the quiet rhythm of the diner, there was a subtle shift in how the room saw him. Not dramatic, not spoken, but present, in the way eyes followed just a second longer, in the way conversations did not immediately resume, as if everyone needed to recalibrate what they thought they understood, and Rex walked beside him now, instead of ahead, his body still alert, but no longer rigid, the tension easing from his shoulders in small increments, the kind of controlled release that came from training, from knowing exactly when a moment had passed, and when it had not, and Ethan guided the chair past the narrow aisle, past the table where the group now stood quieter than before, their energy no longer spilling outward but folding inward, contained, uncertain. And one of them, the same young man who had moved the chair, glanced down briefly as Ethan passed, not quite meeting his eyes, not quite looking away, caught somewhere in between, and Ethan did not slow, did not acknowledge it. Because some lessons do not need acknowledgement to take root. They only need to be experienced. And as he reached the other side of the room, near the hallway that led to the restrooms, he paused just long enough to adjust his position, turning the chair with a smooth, practiced motion. And for a moment, he faced the window again. The rain now heavier, streaking faster, the world outside blurred into motion and light, and something in that movement pulled at memory, not sharply, not enough to break the present, but enough to remind him of another place, another time where sound had carried differently, where stillness had meant something else entirely. And Rex felt it immediately, the subtle shift in Ethan's breathing, the way his shoulders held just a fraction tighter, and without hesitation he stepped closer, pressing lightly against the side of the chair, a quiet contact, grounding, familiar, the kind that did not ask questions but offered presence. And Ethan's hand moved down instinctively, resting for a second on the thick fur at the back of Rex's neck, fingers curling, slightly as if confirming something real, something here, something now. And across the room, one of the older men at the counter, a veteran by the look of him, broad shoulders worn down by years rather than weakness, had been watching the entire exchange without interruption, his coffee untouched, his gaze steady. And as Ethan turned slightly, their eyes met just briefly, not in recognition of identity, but in recognition of something deeper, something shared without needing words, a quiet understanding that passed between people who had both learned how silence could carry more truth than noise ever could. and the man gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, but deliberate, a gesture not of praise, not of sympathy, but of respect, and Ethan returned it just as subtly before shifting his gaze away, because respect, real respect, does not linger, it simply acknowledges and moves on, and behind him the group had begun to settle again, their voices returning in lower tones, their laughter now measured, careful, as if the moment had drawn a boundary they could not quite step past again. And the chair that had once blocked the path remained pushed aside, slightly out of place now, no longer a symbol of anything, just an object returned to its proper role, and the waitress finally moved again, setting down a fresh cup of coffee at the counter with hands that were steady but thoughtful, her eyes drifting once more toward Ethan and Rex, a softness there, a quiet appreciation for something she could not fully explain but did not need to, and outside the storm continued, steady and unrelenting. But inside the diner, something had shifted in a way that would outlast the rain. Something small, almost invisible, but real. And as Ethan turned his chair to head back toward his table, Rex at his side, the space around them felt different. Not larger, not safer, just more honest, as if the truth of who he was had brushed against the surface of the world for a brief moment and left a mark that could not be easily erased. When Ethan returned to his table, the diner did not go back to what it had been, not completely, because moments like that do not vanish, they settle into the walls, into the quiet spaces between people, and even as forks lifted again and low conversations resumed, there was a new awareness threading through the room, subtle but steady, like a current beneath still water, and Ethan guided his chair in a place with the same calm precision, turning slightly so his back was never fully exposed. A habit shaped long before this night, and Rex circled once before lying down again, but this time closer, angled just enough to keep both Ethan and the room within his line of sight, his ears still alert, his breathing slower now, controlled but never careless, and Ethan reached for his coffee, now lukewarm, and took a quiet sip, not because he needed it, but because routine has a way of grounding the body when the mind is still catching up. And for a moment, it seemed as if the night might simply continue, the storm outside, the soft hum of the radio, the ordinary rhythm returning piece by piece, but across the room, the older man at the counter shifted, setting his cup down with a deliberate motion, the kind that carried intention without urgency. And he stood, not quickly, not dramatically, just rising with the quiet steadiness of someone who had learned long ago how to move without drawing attention. And he walked toward Ethan, each step measured, his boots soft against the tile, until he stopped a few feet from the table, close enough to speak, far enough to respect space. And for a second he said nothing, his eyes taking the details, the posture, the dog, the way Ethan held himself even while seated, and there was recognition there now, not of a face, not of a name, but of something deeper, something that did not need introduction. And when he finally spoke, his voice was low, even carrying the weight of years without forcing it. You served, it was not a question, and Ethan looked up, meeting his gaze without hesitation, without surprise, just acknowledgement, and after a brief pause he nodded once, a small motion, but enough, and the man exhaled softly, as if confirming something he had already known, and he glanced down at Rex, his expression shifting slightly, not into a smile, but it is something close to respect. He did too, and Rex's ears flicked at the sound, his head lifting just enough to acknowledge the presence without breaking his calm, and Ethan's hand rested lightly against the table, his fingers still, his voice quiet when he answered. He still does, and the words settled between them, simple, but layered, carrying more than they revealed, and the older man nodded again, slower this time, as if the meaning had landed exactly where it needed to, and behind them, one of the younger men shifted in. His seat, his voice low, uncertain. Wait, you mean, but the words faded before they could form fully, because something in the air made it clear that this was not a conversation meant to be interrupted. And the man at the table did not turn to them, did not acknowledge their presence. He simply reached into his pocket and pulled out a small worn coin, turning it once between his fingers before placing it gently on Ethan's table, the metal catching the dim light, its edges softened by time, and Ethan's eyes dropped to it, just for a second, and something flickered there, not surprise, not pride, but memory, and he did not pick it up immediately. He simply looked, as if recognizing something that did not belong to this place, this moment, but had found its way here anyway, and the man stepped back then, giving a small nod once more before turning away, returning to the counter without another word, and the silence that followed was not heavy, not tense, but full, as if something had been completed without needing explanation, and Rex lowered his head again, his body easing further into rest, but his eyes remained open, watchful, always watchful, and Ethan finally reached for the coin, turning it once in his fingers, the faint outline of its engraving brushing against his skin, grounding him in a way the coffee never could. And across the room the young men sat quieter now, their earlier confidence replaced by something more thoughtful, something closer to understanding than they might ever admit, and outside the rain began to soften, the steady rhythm easing into a lighter pattern, as if the storm itself had decided to let go, and inside, without any announcement, without any clear moment of change, the night had shifted into something quieter, something deeper, something that would stay long after everyone had gone their separate ways. The coin rested in Ethan's palm longer than it should have, its weight small but unmistakable, the kind of weight that did not come from metal alone, but from everything it had passed through before reaching him. And his thumb traced its worn edge once, slowly, as if confirming it was real, as if grounding himself in something that did not shift or change with the room around him. And Rex watched that movement. Not the coin itself, but the meaning behind it, the subtle softening in Ethan's shoulders, the quiet exhale that followed. And for the first time since they had entered the diner, there was something close to ease settling between them. Not complete, not careless, but present enough to be felt, and across the room the young men had fallen into a quieter rhythm, their voices lower now, their laughter gone, replaced by short exchanges that did not carry beyond their table. And one of them glanced over again, not with the same careless confidence as before, but with hesitation, as if trying to understand something that had shifted just out of reach. And when their eyes met for a brief second, he looked away first, not out of fear, but out of recognition, the kind that comes when a moment forces you to reconsider what you thought you knew. And the waitress approached Ethan's table then, her steps softer now, more deliberate, setting down a fresh cup of coffee without being asked, the steam rising in thin curls that caught the dim light on the house. She said quietly, her voice carrying a warmth that did not need explanation, and Ethan looked up, offering a small nod. Thank you. Simple, genuine. And she lingered for just a second, her gaze shifting briefly to Rex, then back again. Good dog, she added, almost to herself before stepping away, and Rex's tail moved once against the floor, a small acknowledgement, restrained but unmistakable, and the room continued to breathe around them, steady, calmer now, as if whatever had tightened it before had been released without breaking. And outside the rain had softened to a gentle patter, the kind that no longer demanded attention but simply existed, and headlights passed less frequently now, the road beginning to empty as the night settled deeper, and Ethan lifted the new cup, the heat stronger this time, more immediate, and for a moment he simply held it, letting the warmth seep into his hands, into his bones, as if reminding himself that he was here, that this was now, not then, and Rex shifted slightly closer, his body leaning just enough to make contact again, a quiet anchor, and Ethan's hand moved down once more, resting against his fur, fingers pressing gently, as if to say what words never needed to. And in that small gesture there was a bond that did not depend on explanation, something built over time, over distance, over moments that had tested and proven it again and again. And across the diner the older man at the counter finished his coffee, leaving a few bills beneath the cup before standing, his glance passing once more toward Ethan, not lingering, not demanding acknowledgement, just a final quiet recognition before he stepped out into the night, the door opening briefly to let in the cool air before closing again. And with his departure something else settled, a sense of completion, as if the moment had reached its natural end without needing anything more, and the young men at their table began to gather their things, their movements subdued, one of them hesitating for a second before pushing his chair back improperly. A small act, almost insignificant, but intentional, and they left without another word. The door closing behind them with a soft thud that seemed quieter than before, and the diner returned fully now to its ordinary rhythm. But it was not the same ordinary, not quite, because something had been seen, something had been understood, and it lingered in the way people moved, in the way they looked at one another just a fraction differently. And Ethan sat there a moment longer, the coin still in his hand, the warmth of the coffee steady, Rex at his side. And for the first time that night, there was no tension left in the air between them, only a quiet stillness that did not feel empty, but complete. The diner grew quieter in a way that felt earned, not forced, as if the night itself had decided to settle into something softer, something more honest. And Ethan sat there a moment longer than he needed to, the coin still resting in his hand, his thumb brushing across its surface one last time before he slipped it carefully into the pocket of his jacket, not as something to display, not as something to explain, but as something to carry, something that belonged to a part of his life that did not need words anymore. And Rex shifted slightly beside him, lifting his head as if sensing the change before it happened, his ears turning toward the door, toward the fading sound of rain, toward whatever came next. And Ethan set his cup down, now empty, the warmth gone but the quiet still there, and he placed his hands lightly on the wheels of his chair, pausing just for a breath, not because he needed to, but because he chose to, because sometimes moving forward is not about urgency, it is about intention. And when he finally pushed, the motion was smooth, steady, the same as it had always been. And Rex rose with him without command, falling into place at his side, not leading, not following, but staying exactly where he was needed. And as they moved toward the door, the waitress glanced up again, offering a small smile that carried no pity, only recognition, and Ethan returned it with a nod, simple, quiet, enough, and the bell above the door chimed softly as he pushed it open, the cool night air brushing against his face, carrying the scent of rain and asphalt, clean in a way that only comes after something has passed. And outside the storm had almost completely faded, leaving behind a damp stillness, the road stretching out under dim streetlights, reflections shimmering in shallow puddles like fragments of something that had been broken and put back together again. And Ethan paused just beyond the doorway, not looking back, not needing to, because whatever had happened inside did not belong to that space anymore. It had already moved with him, settled somewhere deeper. And Rex stepped forward slightly, his paws silent against the wet ground, his body relaxed now, but never unaware, his presence steady in a way that did not demand attention, but shaped it anyway. And for a moment, they simply stood there, the quiet stretching out around them, the world no longer pressing in, no longer testing, just existing. And Ethan exhaled slowly, the breath leaving him lighter than it had been when he walked in, and he reached down, his hand resting against the side of Rex's neck, fingers pressing gently into the familiar warmth, and there was no need for words, no need for acknowledgement, because some things are understood in the spaces between, in the silence that follows when nothing else needs to be said. And Rex leaned into that touch just slightly, a small movement, almost imperceptible, but full of meaning, full of everything they had carried together, everything they had walked through and would continue to walk through. And then Ethan lifted his hand, settling it back on the wheel, and with a quiet push, he moved forward into the night, the chair rolling smoothly along the damp pavement, Rex at his side, the two of them disappearing slowly into the soft glow of the streetlights, leaving behind nothing but a memory that would linger in that diner long after they were gone, not as a story of conflict, not as a moment of confrontation, but as something quieter, something deeper, a reminder that strength does not always stand tall, does not always speak loudly, and that sometimes the truest kind of power is the kind that never needs to prove itself at all. In a quiet roadside diner on a rain-soaked night, A former U.S. Marine in a wheelchair and his loyal German Shepherd step into a moment that reveals the true meaning of strength, loyalty, and silent justice. What begins as a simple stop for coffee slowly unfolds into one of those unforgettable animal stories where judgment meets truth and assumptions quietly fall apart. As tension builds through subtle glances, shifting voices, and a narrow path deliberately blocked, the Marine does not react with anger, but with calm restraint, while the German Shepherd senses what others cannot, responding not with chaos, but with controlled presence, reminding everyone that loyalty is not loud, but deeply rooted. This is one of those rare animal stories where no physical conflict is needed, only a moment of recognition that changes everything. As the situation reaches its peak, a single growl reshapes the room, not as a threat, but as a boundary drawn by trust, training, and unbreakable bond, turning what seemed like weakness into something undeniably powerful. Through layered emotional storytelling, this narrative stands among the most compelling animal stories that highlight the connection between human resilience and canine intuition, showing how true protection often comes without a single act of violence. When a fellow veteran recognizes what others fail to see, the story deepens into a quiet exchange of respect, symbolized by a simple coin and a shared understanding that does not need explanation. Unlike typical animal stories driven by action, this story thrives on stillness, on emotional weight, and on the unseen history carried by both the Marine and his dog. As the storm outside fades, so does the tension inside, leaving behind a transformed space where people move differently, think differently, and remember what they witnessed. In the end, this becomes one of those lasting animal stories that does not shout its message but leaves it behind in silence, proving that strength does not always stand tall, and sometimes the most powerful moments are the ones where nothing happens, yet everything changes. Among modern animal stories, this narrative stands out as a cinematic reminder that even the smallest act of presence, loyalty, and restraint can restore dignity, shift perspective, and reveal a deeper kind of courage that never needed to prove itself at all.